They say life is a journey, but that's no metaphor for nomads. And in the endless depths of space, we may see entire civilizations that exist not on planets, but traveling between them. The spaceship Ganymede's Hand was commissioned at the Jovian shipyards to serve as part of a colonial fleet in the year 2424, and by the year 3434, 1,000 years later, it had undergone many transformations not just in shape, but in mission and status. That included being a mutinous vessel delivering its splinter of the fleet to a rebel colony, and then later as a diplomatic envoy to those old friends turned enemies. It's been a freighter, a garbage barge, and even a glorified prison transport during those centuries, then a pirate ship in the eyes of many, and now on the run from the inner sphere of humanity's colonization, where they have few friends. Now they are so far away from the sun that first shone down on Ganymede's Hand when it was built that it can no longer be seen with the naked eye, and passing through a volume of space almost devoid of humanity. Those systems nearby are either entirely unsettled, home to a fledgling colony, or perhaps some automated probe or constructor preparing basic infrastructure. That ship has changed greatly since it first launched, retrofitted and expanded a patchwork collection of add-ons that no longer resemble the smaller and sleeker vessel that first set sail from Jupiter. It's a hodgepodge of connected communities grown like a coral reef out from the main body of the ship, and Ganymede's Hand has its own small fleet of tender vessels and picket ships riding along with it through the void, like a whale and many fish, and is home to hundreds of thousands of people. While the outer superstructure of the ship on the front side is still fairly streamlined, the interior expands ever more backward with irregular blisters and add-ons that better resemble a sprawling three-dimensional shantytown than a well-designed community. The engineers are very dubious on if the ship can accelerate or turn at even half the speed it was originally designed for without snapping or scattering many of these additions, and have gotten more aggressive at enforcing building rules inside and behind the ship. You can never really run out of growing space in space, but people are starting to feel cramped and confined. Many feel it's time to stop running, that they are far from anyone who might have the ability and interest to come after them, and they are unlikely to make the effort and grow less likely every year. That nobody cares about their crimes long ago, and surely historians have helped others see they were pushed by circumstance and often justified. Others argue that the Retribution fleet is probably not far behind them, that their would-be jailers would also have been chosen for having a relentless mindset, and if anything they would have grown more obsessed with their capture since then. Others argue they've operated under this assumption far too long, and that it's just another excuse to maintain their eternal state of martial law and dominance by their admiral and the captains. Ahead is a promising system, ideal for refueling and reloading their fleet with raw materials, but also containing a planet ideal for settlement that has no beacon announcing a claim by others, nor do the unencrypted transmissions from Earth mention any such claims or colony missions en route. They estimate they could dig in here and have at least a century to prepare before any other unknown colony fleet might arrive, which would surely detour if confronted with a colonized and fortified system, especially if they offered them logistical aid in finding and reaching a new empty system. Some say the ghost-like sightings of the Retribution fleet are made up by those seeking to keep the fleet moving, or some other ships following them by coincidence, or that they stopped and fortified they could defeat that fleet. But others are not so sure, and they think they should not even stop to resupply, as they could get safer by going longer and just endure a few more decades of hardship and rationing. In the end, they decide to slow quickly and refuel and take on an asteroid or two for raw materials to process, and plant a few automated monitors behind on the asteroid to see who follows. Anyone who doesn't want to respect the Admiral's decision is welcome to remain behind, of course. One day they may end their long exodus, but that day is not today, and they continue their life as stellar nomads. One of the recurring points we have on this show is that it is often going to be easier, faster, and better to build a large rotating space habitat than to terraform an entire planet. This is definitely debatable if we're instead contemplating doming a planet over piece by piece as needed, or alternatively building enough O'Neill cylinder habitats to equal an Earth-sized planet in area, which would be roughly 1 million of them. The other key advantage of such habitats is that building 1 million of them takes way less mass than a planet, anywhere from 1,000th to 1,000,000th of material, depending on how deep you want your dirt and terrain to go underneath you. On Earth it goes down 4,000 miles or 6,400 kilometers, and it's hard to imagine your habitat would need more than 4 miles of dirt, especially as you might have hollow spots inside hills or dimples in the hull for deeper seas, without needing to use so much mass. That would be 1,000th and is too much. 1,000,000th would be just 6.4 meters or 21 feet, which might be too little. And while it can seem a bit crazy to imagine building all the ground under your feet, we should keep in mind that even if you're just doming a planet, not fully terraforming it, that still requires building a floor and a ceiling to keep out the probably toxic, untreated native regolith and keep your atmosphere inside and the local atmosphere out. There are a lot of occasions where that dome or group of domes will be easier than building a rotating habitat, but the key notion is that they are on a similar order of magnitude, and a place needing more space for growing a population can build vastly more habitat living space from a planet than its own living area, and these are very Earth-like environments, if you want them to be, whereas very few planets will be in that Earth-like bracket. Even fewer moons will be, and no asteroids at all, so we plan to convert those into living space, which by default is rotating habitats, but could also be nutrient tanks and computer banks if we're imagining folks living in the Matrix, or entirely digital minds. Again, this is very important as a concept to a lot of the discussion on this show, as it informs us how humanity will settle the stars. But a second key point, particularly for today, is that you might need very long-term habitats on your spaceships to get to those other stars, and many folks won't be settling down anywhere at all. In truth, there's very little difference between a spaceship and a space habitat at a basic level, particularly interstellar ones in a universe that doesn't allow FTL or faster-than-light travel. Both are big, airtight vessels that need to be able to keep people alive and sane for long voyage periods, though that's like saying there's very little difference between a limousine with a hot tub on it and a big cruise ship with a pool. Cruise ships don't accelerate much, and even when tossing and turning on the ocean a fair bit, it's a lot different than a car jamming the brakes or accelerator. A ship only planning to accelerate at 100th of a G can get away with a fairly natural landscape inside its habitation drums, but even if it only plans to get up to 5% of light speed, it's going to need 5 years each to speed up and slow down, and effectively take 5 more years to reach its destination compared to something pulling a full G. It's entirely possible that's still your most efficient acceleration curve, given that most engine designs get less efficient the harder you push, resulting in a slower maximum speed for the same fuel. But if you want to slam the brakes or be able to jink the ship quickly in some other direction to dodge a bit of debris, you need to be thinking spaceship in your design, not a habitat as near to Earth-in conditions as possible. Not every interstellar ship is going to be a giant space habitat, of course. A lot would depend on the available technology, better propulsion, and of course, FTL changes that landscape. Also, a stellar nomad could be an individual who travels from system to system while frozen for the trip, or even someone who sends a digital copy of their mind at the speed of light to a duplicated body or android in another star system. On the other side of things, as we began discussing with our opening tale about the folks from the ship Ganymede's Hand, you don't necessarily need to be a fleet with a destination in mind, just stops along the way. In point of fact, you don't necessarily need to ever stop, as you might have enough resources stockpiled to last as long as you ever need, as we imagine scenarios like a planet ship, or a Shikata thruster carrying a whole solar system out beyond the galaxy. I would argue that if you have no temporary destinations in mind, such as an exodus to deep intergalactic space to be left alone, you're not really nomadic. Nomads move around places, but the simple act of motion isn't really what distinguishes them. A nomad is a person or a member of a group of people who do not have a fixed residence but move from place to place, usually seasonally and within a defined territory. The lifestyle of nomads is typically characterized by their mobility and their reliance on temporary dwellings. Nomadism can be categorized into several types based on the primary activities and reason for movement. 1. Pastoral nomads. These nomads depend on domesticated livestock for their livelihood. They move their herds to different pastures throughout the year to ensure a steady supply of grazing resources. Nomad derives from the Greek and Latin for describing wandering shepherds and tends to be the default we have in mind for the term. 2. Hunter-gatherer nomads. These groups move in search of food sources, hunting animals and gathering wild plants. This was the predominant lifestyle before the development of agriculture, and while relatively uncommon nowadays in favor of our next category, we might see a resurgence in it for folks doing cometary shepherding or asteroid harvesting. 3. Peripatetic nomads. These nomads move from place to place offering their services, trades, or crafts. They often have specialized skills that are in demand in various locations. The root word, peripatetic, literally means walking up and down, and your classic example is a journeyman crafter who plies his trade from village to village or project to project. A merchant vessel or caravan that runs a long track between multiple ports of call would fall into this category too. 4. Tourist nomads. Arguably a subset of peripatetic nomads, but in this case the primary motive is seeing new places, and for a wealthy individual or one in a post-scarcity society, they need no other means of support. Indeed, they are arguably using sightseeing as the means of supporting themselves against feelings of ennui or purposelessness, which is a potentially major survival concern in advanced civilizations. I wanted to emphasize the survival aspect of sightseeing in a post-scarcity environment because the other three, hunter-gatherer, pastoral, and peripatetic, are generally more obviously subsistence or job-related, so it's easier to see how that would be critical to a person or group surviving. Thinking of it from a more psychological perspective is important to get in the mix because direct material survival of an individual may not be a big factor in the future compared to a need to feel like you're doing something important or seeing something new and exciting. Indeed, I'd make the case it's already a major factor in a lot of modern nomadic behavior, which could arguably include commercial interstate truck drivers, or pilots and crew on board planes, trains, cruise ships, freighters, or often the motivation for enlisting in the military. Nomadism is often driven by environmental conditions, availability of resources, cultural traditions, and economic needs. While traditional nomadic lifestyles have declined due to modernization and changes in land use, some traditional nomadic groups still exist today, maintaining their cultural practices and way of life, while others such as RV caravanners emerge as their own modern subcultures. And indeed, many modern cruise ships have 1,000 employees on them. It's hard to argue that's not a subculture all on its own. I don't want all of our focus to be on spaceships today, but it is the major one, as likely not just at the interstellar scale but at the interplanetary scale, around asteroid belts, or even just among a planet and its moons. As a parallel to a cruise ship, the Aldrin Cycler is a slow boat means of traveling between any two bodies in a star system, like Mars and Earth, where you basically make a big heavy station or a container ship that slowly moves on a very elliptical orbit that cross both their normal orbits regularly, and while those planets are passing by. As an amusing side note, planet itself means wanderer. They moved around the otherwise static night sky, and we didn't know we lived on one at the time, but it's good to remember that planets and the stars themselves move around a lot. Cycler spacecraft let smaller ships with fewer amenities and radiation or collision shielding dock with them for the trip, and the largest portion of the full elliptical orbit is spent out past both of those planets. So odds are good this would be a segment of the trip spent in hibernation mode, offloading most of the crew at the last stop and just keeping a tender crew and security team around to make sure it didn't break down or get hijacked by space pirates. These really huge cyclers we call a cycler castle, and we discussed them in depth in their own episode, including interstellar versions, but you could have one that was doing an orbit around Earth and the Moon, or between two of the Jovian moons like Ganymede and Europa. For a two-planet or two-moon cycler, the full orbital time is always at least a little longer than the orbit of the most distant second body, around the primary, which is the Sun for the two planets. But a lunar cycler castle would be able to make a multi-petal orbit that makes much more frequent stops at Earth and gets the Moon in less than a lunar year or a month. and castle is very appropriate here, as we can slap huge amounts of armor on them to protect them from space debris and the radiation in the Van Allen belt, that small ships leaving Earth or the Moon to rendezvous with the Cyclo Castle cannot afford. I could probably do a whole episode just on the various petal patterns, shamrock orbits, or mushroom patch cyclos Buzz Aldrin, Igorov, Ehrenstoff, or Genova have discussed, though if you're interested, Aldrin and Genova's paper, A Free Return Earth-Moon Cyclo Orbit for an Interplanetary Cruise Ship, is a fun read. Not too technical, as is their more recent paper, Circumlunar Free Return Cyclo Orbits for a Manned Earth-Moon Space Station, which goes into more details. But the idea of an interplanetary cruise ship certainly fits the nomadic life, and while cyclos are specifically free return, which means you use no fuel after getting them on that orbit, except for station keeping, we can certainly imagine powered versions doing faster voyages. But this episode is about stellar nomads, not planetary nomads or even cometary mining nomads. See our comet mining episode or colonizing series for more discussion of those processes, and that can include some neat options like being on a ship that slowly tags icy bodies to shove them to thirsty planets like Mars, or long merchant or mining routes among the asteroids to trade goods, move people, or pick up ore for eventual shipment back to Earth. I think you would certainly see those in use out at the moons of Jupiter, which is what brought Ganymede's Hand to mind, one of the fictional ships from our recent episode Life as a Planetary Governor, which was also a hat tip to our episode on colonizing Ganymede and living in lunar lava tubes, hence why it appears in today's episode in our introductory tale. In that episode, Ganymede's Hand was a bit of a tag-along vessel to the main fleet, which had come from Earth and wanted to settle a planet, New Actium, but knew they needed some interplanetary infrastructure on icy body mining and was accompanied by a smaller contingent from Jupiter that specialized in such work. That fleet encountered a rogue body in the interstellar void that was a much better and easier colony target for that smaller contingent, and the Ganymede's Hand broke off to settle it instead. We could easily see a lot of quasi-interstellar nomads that were servicing Oort cloud objects or rogue bodies that were on the hazy outskirts of one star system or part of none and near two. It is not hard to imagine dozens of deep space bodies having small colonies on them that some nomadic vessel plied trade and travel to, possibly with some port of call or hub, although possibly none, and with none of those ports being particularly bigger than the others. Those might be trips of months or years, even with a powerful fusion engine running that ship. I should note that many star clusters have a spacey of less than a light year between the typical neighboring stars too, which makes nomadic interstellar life a lot more viable there. Similarly, we might see Earth having a heavy trade to interstellar colonies where they ship home metals at slow speeds to pay off incurred colony costs or to keep paying for new scientific data or entertainment from home. Those might have nomadic traders living on such freighters. For context, a ship carrying 100 megatons of metal home to Earth and taking a whole century to do it is averaging a megaton per year. If we assumed a modern price for, say, aluminum of a few $1,000s a ton, and assume the trade allowed 10% of that as pay for the crew, that's a few $100s a ton, and thus a few $100 million per year for pay, which by modern expectations would presumably permit a crew of at least a couple thousand, which is probably a lot more than some bulk freighter drifting from System A to System B at a few percent of light speed needs. Now, trying to guess what qualifies as economical in the future is like trying to guess the weather you'll experience next month, and where you don't even know your travel itinerary yet. We can only speak in generalities, but the galaxy is full of mass, and most of that is hydrogen and helium, which are good fuels and propellant for interstellar ships, so it seems very likely you'd be willing to use a good deal more of them to move your metals around, which plausibly permits travel at a few percent of light speed or even higher. How much Earth could charge in terms of fusion fuel or metals for technology and data is harder to say, but probably a lot. Metals don't really require fast shipping, so speeding the journey up isn't really necessary. We could imagine faster cargoes or passenger liners doing near light speed too. The thing is, interstellar in a no-FTL universe means never returning to the same place twice, because even a 10-year round-trip journey to your nearest neighboring star is depositing you a decade in the future. This show turns 10 years old later this month, on September 17, 2024, and the world was fairly different at the time it started. Certainly my own life was, and yours too, I bet. But a more realistic interstellar nomad is looking at centuries, and in 1924, life was pretty different. Life in 1824 even more so. We often discuss the idea of Gardner fleets for colonization on this show. Ships that stop in promising systems, drop off some colonists, fill back up on raw materials, then head out to the next star while they breed up more colonists and crew, and turn those raw materials into more colonial gear and ships. They work their way slowly out to the galactic rim and have a chain connecting them all the way back to Earth, and potentially a 250,000 years later, or more, turn back at the galaxy's edge and head home, touring those systems they planted that have had as long to grow as it's been since humanity basically began. They probably made that trip faster on the way back than the way out, but imagine being one of the original crew, sustained all that time by life extension technology and stasis, and dreaming of coming home to Earth of, say, the 25th century, and arriving in the year 50-20-24, many thousands of centuries later. In Alastair Reynolds' epic House of Suns, we see a group of clones who set off in the 30th century from our solar system on their own separate ships, determined to explore and help settle the galaxy, and then to meet up every so often to exchange notes and memories. They number 1,000 initially, and are called a line, and several others have done this too. As time passes, the ships get faster, but their circuits get longer, so they travel the galaxy in cycles of a couple 100,000 years between meetups and experience very little time personally, watching the galaxy change as relativity and stasis technology lets them leapfrog through time, experiencing 6 million years of galactic history in what for them is just a rather long lifetime. They are essentially our tourist example, as they began the journey as wealthy members of an already post-scarcity society, so wanted for nothing materially, but they wanted for something spiritually. And traveling the galaxy exploring helped them keep going while civilization after civilization collapsed, not because humanity is particularly short-term or warlike or greedy, but because 1,000,000 years is just such a long time that any civilization that really did last that long, relatively unchanged, would be accused of being horrifyingly stagnant. So it is not hard to imagine touring the galaxy to keep sane, and a personal spaceship might not even be required. You hitchhike on big freighters, helping crew to pay your way or going into the freezer, or traveling digitally, sending a copy of your mind being implanted into a body, as we see in stories like Altered Carbon or others. There's hundreds of billions of star systems that might be settled, and even traveling between those at light speed would require longer than most of those stars had left to live to visit each in order, even on the shortest path in a very brief stay. Of course, you might go that duplication path yourself, sending out 1,000 copies that go to some place, then transmit back to an agreed upon location to be re-merged into one mind. Maybe as those Gardner fleets branched out, you sent a copy of your mind in a cloned body on each new splinter of the fleet, planning to re-merge them one day. This does not seem like a great path to maintain your sanity to me, but of course we have no idea how well a Gestalt consciousness might do if technology allowed their creation. Speaking of multiplicity, on those Gardner fleets or other big ships, we could have entire communities forming throughout a bigger ship. Some of those might have internal land areas closer to that of a nation than a city, and ships traveling the void together can be pretty close. Even if you were running megaton ships full of antimatter, which if they exploded from an accident would go off like tens of billions of megatons of nuclear devices, it's probably not lethal to a fellow spaceship 1,000,000 kilometers away, just a few light seconds, and even at that range a physical tether could connect those ships to allow rapid transport between them by tram. Shuttles work too, of course, and would need little fuel, though more than a tram. In the interstellar void, ships moving in a formation are effectively stationary objects that just happen to have interstellar gas and dust storms blowing past them at millions of miles per hour, which is not as bad as that speed implies since it's so near vacuum out there. So thinking of all those ships as just a bunch of space habitats and stations sharing a stationary, windswept chunk of space is a good approach to viewing them, as they might be sitting for decades or centuries between stops, and indeed might not actually stop, but instead move a bit slower than their maximum group speed, and send off various other ships to drop off material or pick up new supplies and fuel. which is handy too because while we often emphasize that flying through space only requires fuel to speed up at the beginning and slow down at the end or at chosen stops, you burn supplies to keep operating too. While the energy needs for any fleet moving at 1% or more of light speed are almost entirely for speeding up and slowing down, not life support or manufacturing, even on 1,000-year-long journeys, it does start adding up. And that's also assuming you only lose mass to generate thrust or power. You've got a pretty good ship with a pretty good hull if it's managing to leak less than 1% of its air and water supplies a year, and a sustained 1% leak will drop your onboard supplies down to 36% after a century, and to 13% after 2 centuries, and down to just 1.8% after 300 years. Your leakage rate will slow as you leak more. 0.004% after 1,000 years, and that's also the kind of timeline where more sophisticated equipment and even frozen people would be taking critical radiation damage not from the radiation-soaked environment beyond the ship, but rather from the various radioisotopes mixed in trace amounts inside your equipment and bodies. You can lower leaks with a thicker hull and multiple airlocks on the way from the pressurized section to the actual outside, which bigger ships can't afford. But you also have to assume you're not losing material to ablating off the hull from the little motes of dust whacking you at near light speed, and just general losses to recycling and accidents. That shuttle that blew up between 2 stops may be replaceable, but you're probably not recovering most of its mass. Nomadic cultures already have a reputation for traveling light and not carrying much that takes up space and weight, much as folks who fly on business a lot or spend a lot of time on the road tend to learn to pack light. I remember living out of a duffel bag a lot when I was in the army, and it wasn't for me, but I did do it, and being raised that way makes it easier. The thing about generation ships is you don't personally need to be all that low on mass, since all your reserves and other things typically store just as well as items rather than raw materials, though your culture might still put a heavy emphasis on low mass living, especially as they can only stop and take resources for free if they exist in uncolonized space or near the periphery of it, as that expands ever outward from Earth. Those operating closer in will either need to trade something for those new supplies or turn piratic, though an awful lot of nomad cultures in history have not entirely unearned reputations for conducting pirate raids and brigandage. On the other hand, in a lot of cases, they can take on raw materials from a mining base and instead of transporting them unchanged, turn them into goods on their journey to the next stop. Transporting goods between places can be a profitable nomadic life, but all the more so if you're doing value-added steps along the way, like taking on food from an agricultural space hab and processing it en route, or processing ore and refining, or any number of other options. It's a handy approach because you have a lot of time on your hands, and space to work in, so if your crew can more profitably alter the cargo in that travel time than it costs to keep them awake rather than on ice, it's a good idea. And every bit of waste or excess crew or extra mass you're shoving around, or lose to leakage, is coming out of your profits, or how big a nomadic community you can support, which also might get restless if they expect a certain standard of living and decide to pick up and leave or schism into a rival fleet. So it helps to have a culture that encourages austerity in things that it's hardest for you to provide them, which for non-colonial ships is probably going to be lots of mass-heavy ecosystems. Space station waypoints might then have extra reason for having large green spaces, parks and gardens and nature preserves, because the ships don't have them. Even this doesn't really imply much austerity, since virtual environments and augmented reality let you enjoy a lot of options that might be too mass-heavy for a ship, while a bigger ship should still have tons of room for actual garden environments. In our Cyborg Civilizations episode, we did note how austerity measures might push a civilization towards transhuman, cyborg, or even digital existences just to make a low-energy, low-resource life easier and permit more folks to live on the ship. Gardener ships can dump off people at a new solar system every few decades, so have that release valve on population growth. But a nigh-immortal society on a slow boat meant for traveling 1,000 light-years between stops might push folks towards a post-human existence just so more of them could live on less resources, or so they could afford to avoid stopping for resupply as often, where some pursuing entity like the hypothetical retribution fleet from our intro story might catch up on them. Nomad life is a lot like city life or rural life, in that beyond a few vague points of overlap, it's too general a term to speak to a whole culture over multiple continents and many centuries. A peasant living in medieval Germany has a very different life as a farmer than one in Babylon or Egypt, or in the industrial age in England have, and nothing much like right now in, say, Kansas or Ohio. I live on a farm after all. And the reality is that Los Angeles isn't much like Los Angeles of 50 years ago, or New York now or a century ago, or Babylon or Rome or London of any era. So too, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers don't really have much to do with modern nomads or the many variations in the many centuries between. So trying to guess what might pop up in terms of culture for space nomads is rather tricky, and I'd love to hear your insights in the comments section of the episode. Ultimately though, with vast differences between planets and the even vaster distances between stars, we will get to find out a lot about the life of stellar nomads. And even if we got FTL working somehow, we wouldn't merely raise that scale to traveling between galaxies and superclusters. Traveling between distant stars and distant times, you can never truly come home again, and so every space traveler will be a nomad in their own way as they sail out to the stars. It seems like AI is at the center of everything these days, and I hate to say it is overhyped because people keep finding new and novel ways to use AI. Unfortunately, one of those is companies using AI to harvest and sell your data. People source sites publish your personal information, including details about family members, for anyone to look up online. In one case, a child advocacy worker's own children were found listed on a data broker site as her associates. As a foster and adoptive parent, that gave me the shivers. You can tell them to take that data down, but you are finding those sellers and sending those requests manually, while they use AI. That's where our sponsor Incogni comes in. They use their AI to focus on finding your information online and send automated takedown requests for you. All you have to do is sign up, give them permission to act on your behalf to delete data, then they go to work and your data goes away. You can check up on the progress and see who had your data and how detailed and risky it was considered. Incogni makes these data harvesters take your info down, and they keep doing it too, making sure that it stays down. Incogni is available risk-free for 30 days, so you can try it out, and get a full refund if you aren't happy with the service. Use code IsaacArthur at the link in the episode description to get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Go to incogni.com/IsaacArthur and take your data back. Next week we'll travel to the Library of Babel, a repository of all books ever to be written, and contemplate truly huge numbers while we're at it. After that, we'll journey to the cities of Mars to ask what a future red planet might look like once settlements become more common and robust. After that, we'll look at anachronistic technologies out of place in time. Then we'll celebrate our show's 10th anniversary with a look at transcendence, the idea that civilizations might move on to some higher layer of reality, or even have moved down to a more compact existence on September 19th. If you'd like to get alerts when those and other episodes come out, make sure to hit the like, subscribe, and notification buttons. You can also help support the show by becoming a member here on YouTube or Patreon, or check out other ways to help at isaacarthur.net. SFIA's episodes also come out early and ad-free on our streaming service Nebula, like this month's exclusive episode, Exploring the Multiverse, at go.nebula.tv/isaacarthur. As always, thanks for watching, and have a great week.